In my past work, I've made one entirely corrugated sculpture, uncontained, and several entirely flat-sided sculptures. On this project, I really like the idea of combining both, which was quite a scary move. They're so very different. Marrying them together nicely was rather a challenge. I quite admire some sculptors who are kind of brazen enough to just use just a few elements. I think I generally go in for sort of ludicrously complicated work, and so this is me trying to sort of simplify things to an extent. I wanted to produce a sculpture with loads of contrast, with a sort of commanding, sharp feel, and hopefully sort of very precarious and unnerving. The middle cube there, it really sets everything else off, and it sort of creates this wonderful sense of unbalance. The base is quite heavy, just these flat panels gives it a real sense of stability. And by the time we're up the top, it's all corrugated and it's sort of screaming at you. I played around with various corrugations, but this quite sort of deep one should remind people of retaining walls on motorways and sea defences, and generally of sort of strength. I think one of the really fantastic things about sculpture is that really all you're playing with is light. Throughout the day the sun sort of moves around and the shadows change, and you know, you get a completely different sculpture every day of the year and every minute that goes by. This little piece, this is where it's all sort of started, and just 6 cubes, but these kind of photocopied, stuck-on bits, they signify where I was starting to think about corrugating some panels. It was enormously challenging finding the right mixture of corrugated panels and flats, and getting the composition absolutely right. I was, you know, running the old wood burner on blocks like this for a few weeks. It's really heavy. So the next step was to make this maquette the third and last. What takes the time with milling is kind of all the setup, and so if you can mill as much as possible in each run, the better. I devised this system of holding all 6 blocks within one sort of weird trough which I made, filled with grout. That meant that the pieces could be held in exactly the right orientation, in very, very rigidly, and I could sort of cut at full power and really yeah, push on through. A sacrificial layer of plaster of Paris had to be poured initially before the grout, and later, after flipping over, this would be smashed off in order to create a clear run for the cutter. It was exciting scraping the plaster away very carefully, like a sort of archaeological dig or something. With the trough flipped over and ready for milling, it was necessary to find the lowest point on all the cubes. So with a dial indicator, I kind of scanned across the whole surface and then plunged down from that point to full depth. Making such heavy cuts in one hit, you've got to flood the whole thing with a lot of coolant. The mill would have had a coolant set up years ago, but it's kind of contaminated and extremely poisonous. So when you're cutting, it's quite necessary to sweep the shavings out the way to stop double cutting happening. I mean, like those guys who used to use that old girl, what would they have thought, you know? Once I took the trough apart and with a hammer smashed the grout off, these kind of like beautiful gemstones appeared, kind of surrounded in kind of ruinous rubble. After I'd broken the cubes out for the first time, it became obvious that the grout had had a sort of funny reaction with the surface of the aluminium. I settled on this method of coating each cube in candle wax, and one that isolated it and stopped the reaction from happening, but it also, to an extent, sort of protected the edges and stuff when you were smashing out. So from this very strict sort of regime of, like, you know, following the numbers and being absolutely precise on the dials, out comes this kind of extraordinary sort of playful geometry. Quite a challenge was joining these cubes together kind of completely invisibly. They've each got a bolt which sort of passes up through. To attach the cubes together, I knew where the bolt would have to come out through the top, and I knew where it would have to be in the bottom of each cube. So I made a sort of set of kind of pincers like this, which would hold the cube in the right line for drilling. Then it was necessary to come up with a kind of clamping arrangement and then drill through with an extremely long drill bit. After this point, it was easy to bolt them together invisibly. Things ran on a bit that day, and yeah, it was pretty exhausted but full of elation when I finally bolted it all up. What's excellent about machining these profiles in is that the resulting joins are so incredibly accurate. My mate, he did cut himself on it. Didn't tell me, just sort of put it in his pocket, I suppose to say. After Uncontained, I was not going about it in the same way again. Got in touch with Fred at Form Capture. He laser scanned the sculpture in 3 dimensions, capturing all of its tiny little details very, very accurately. This model could be worked on by Arthur Francis Sculpture to progress. After much toing and froing of sort of conversations and kind of the finer details of design work, eventually I drove to Leicester. With all my eggs in one basket, this was a big, scary leap of faith. And there wasn't a great deal of discussion as to what would happen if nothing fitted. From Form Capture's 3D scan, Brent had cleverly extrapolated net forms of these folded panels. They look like islands with kind of score lines in them ready for folding. It was really cool because Brent had never ever seen this in 3D, you know, he was like, I know it so well, but it's, you know, all on a screen. The cut panels had little sort of indentations which denoted the fold lines. So after sort of chalking those fold lines up and establishing which side to fold on, some of the panels took 3 of us to lift these panels into the folder and fold them up. I'm gonna get that bug off. You've been on there too long. After getting back from Leicester, laid all the bits out in the workshop and sort of started to assemble the first cube. Whilst the panels fitted together extremely well, they did require a huge amount of wrestling, and I came quite adept at sort of knowing where to poke the levers and so on to make them come together sort of really nicely. My once impossibly massive workshop seemed rather tiny. And so I had to sort of forklift almost all my tools out the way, you know, into kind of long-term storage to fit everything in. Working on such a large scale by yourself does require quite a bit of thought, and it can never be a wing and a prayer. You know, things need to be thought through very carefully. You know, if you use a lever, use a really long one. Try and get the forklift involved to sort of save your back. The maquette is enormously helpful actually for kind of dry running things on the bench. You know, you can see how the thing's going to roll or how it's going to move. So with kind of car jacks and crowbars and the forklift and so on, it's quite possible to make something like this by yourself. For strength, the sculpture's got a massive tube running all the way up to the top. Unfortunately, it's not a straight line. So the internal structure had to be added bit by bit, cube by cube. I had to cut a hole in the top of each cube in the footprint of where the cube above it would sit, so that it was hidden. I made a strange sort of compass arrangement, which after cutting a sort of rough hole, would locate in the top of the tube below, and then you could scribe a sort of really weird shaped hole which the tube would perfectly slot through. It was necessary to prop up the other end with some racking or something before disassembling it all, and then using that racking to put the piece of tube back in place, and that would ensure that it was in exactly the same place. I'm also quite proud of the fact that the computer didn't help with this bit. I've never built a sculpture quite on the scale that it's both necessary and possible to climb around inside. You know, it feels like you're kind of caving or something. It was really, really exciting, kind of weird environment. They were sort of sonically amazing, you know, these sort of industrial, echoey sounds. It's really important to me that the finished result here looks completely solid. You would assume that it was made of one solid piece of metal or wood or something. It's possible with incredibly fine finishing of all the welds to make that happen. Literally weeks of grinding, die grinding, welding and all the things that I sort of love. I first start off with an angle grinder and a grinding wheel, then a flat fibre disc, then a bit of flat wheeling, and then orbital sand. And after that, the join, once rusty, is utterly invisible. When finishing these kind of really awkward, sort of quite deep fillet joints, it was necessary to use this kind of tiny pencil die grinder, a bit like a dentist drill. It was necessary just to get these joins absolutely perfect. It's really weird that I love it still. It was always a bit of a wrestle, sort of working out how to hang each cube in order to position it in place by myself. I've got a series of chains which you can sort of adjust the lengths and a bit of jiggery-pokery, and it was possible to sort of pick them up at just the right angle and then forklift them into place. The sculpture progressed cube after cube after cube, and it was just sort of filling the entire workshop, lying down like a big sort of dinosaur. I'd left provision for one panel on each cube to come off because I'd have to take them off later in order to wax the insides. Corten as a material has outstanding longevity as long as it's allowed to get wet and dry out. The outside of this sculpture has no water traps at all. The inside of the sculpture is likely to be damp, and so protection against corrosion is necessary. I took these panels off, starting at the top and working down, and was able to get inside and wax everything I could sort of reach. Of course, I couldn't wax the weld seam, and that would only be possible once the panel was welded back on from the hole in the one below. I'd made provision for this by leaving a hole in order to sort of poke my arm up inside and wax the weld seam. I devised a method of using a weed sprayer with a kind of endoscope camera which was sort of attached to my phone, and after sort of luckily discovering a chalk hatching kind of method so I could really see it quite clearly, it was actually quite easy to wax the weld seam. was really rewarding at the end to make the signature. I dremeled into the surface to create a shallow impression and then filled this with plumbing solder before sanding it off absolutely flush. And here we got this lovely contrast between the tin and the rusty Corten around it. I really was pretty happy when all the metalwork was complete and I could finally drag the massive beast outside into the sunlight for the first time. I had this idea of sort of turning it into a kind of trailer almost, lifting with the forklift from one end and kind of dragging. On the other end, sort of using the pallet truck and using that as a sort of semi-steerable axle, which sort of just dragged its way along. I used acid in this instance to remove the mill scale as opposed to shot blasting because it meant I could keep it in-house. Shot blasting generally has to happen off-site, or if it's on-site, you're left with the most unbelievable mess everywhere. After every 2 applications of acid, it's necessary to very heavily pressure wash the surface, and it's quite satisfying as the mill scale's just pouring off at this stage. It took about 30 applications of acid, but because I had to do it overnight in freezing conditions, I was literally sort of climbing all over it, pressure washing off kind of sheets of ice. 3 full nights of like -2, yeah. Getting the sculpture upright was the next challenge. Lifting something as large as this up with my forklift is something you will never find in any forklift safety manual. I had to work out a good point to lift from. The aluminium maquette was really useful for this, and I could kind of try a few positions on the bench. The trouble was I was absolutely maxed out on the height on the forklift. Breathing a huge sigh of relief, then it's just sit back and let the weather do the rest. What does the future hold? Who knows? If I was a detective, I would say there seems to be a slight pattern emerging. I'm curious as to know how big it's possible to go whilst still making a sculpture which is in some way sort of relatable in the way that an elephant is, but the Grand Canyon isn't. That's pretty cryptic.